April 1969. The war in Vietnam had already become something else entirely. No longer a clash of armies, it was a collision of doctrines, machines, and beliefs about how war was supposed to be fought. At a remote airstrip hidden deep in the Laotian highlands, something landed that was never meant to. The aircraft came in fast, too fast. Its landing lights flickered, one engine coughing unevenly as it cut through the mist. The runway, little more than a reinforced strip carved out of jungle, was never designed for jets of this size or speed, but the pilot had no choice. With a violent screech of rubber and metal, the aircraft slammed onto the tarmac, bounced once, then settled hard. The nose dipped. The engine finally died. For a moment, there was silence. Then North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or a trap. Parked before them was an American A-6 Intruder. The aircraft had been part of a night strike package flying out of the Gulf of Tonkin. Its mission, low-level penetration, radar-guided bombing against supply routes feeding the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, nothing catastrophic, but enough to rupture a fuel line and cripple navigation systems. Instead of ejecting, the pilot had gambled everything on a desperate landing far from American-controlled territory. The crew was taken prisoner within minutes. The aircraft, astonishingly intact, was camouflaged and concealed before dawn. Within 48 hours, Soviet advisors were quietly informed. Within 10 days, a man named Colonel Sergei Antonov arrived. Antonov was not a politician. He was not an intelligence officer. He was a test pilot, one of the Soviet Union's best. He had flown experimental interceptors that never entered service and aircraft that officially did not exist. He understood machines the way surgeons understand anatomy. When he first saw the intruder, sitting silent under camouflage netting, he stopped walking. "This is not a fighter," he said quietly in Russian. "This is a knife." The A-6 Intruder was unlike anything in the Soviet inventory. Designed not for speed or altitude, but for penetration, it flew low, slow, and blind, trusting its terrain-following radar to guide it through mountains and darkness. Where Soviet strike aircraft relied on brute force and pilot intuition, the Intruder relied on sensors, computers, and trust in automation. Antonov walked around the aircraft for nearly an hour without speaking. The engines were compact but powerful, the airframe broad, almost ungainly, the wings optimized for stability at low altitude, the skin thin, lightweight, clearly not built to absorb punishment. "This aircraft assumes it will not be seen," Antonov finally said. "And if it is seen, it assumes it is already dead." Inside the cockpit, the contrast was even jarring. 2 seats side by side, pilot and bombardier navigator. No gun, no dogfighting capability, just radar scopes, navigation displays, bombing computers. The entire cockpit was designed around one idea: fly into hell at night, deliver ordnance with precision, and escape before anyone understood what had happened. Antonov removed his gloves and ran a hand across the instrument panel. "So much faith," he murmured. The Americans had built a strike aircraft that trusted electronics more than instinct, that trusted systems more than redundancy, that trusted logistics, spare parts, trained crews, uninterrupted fuel supply, and uncontested air superiority. Soviet doctrine trusted none of those things. That evening, Antonov's orders arrived, encrypted and brief. "Fly it, understand it, tell us what it means." The engineers protested.
The manuals were incomplete, the systems unfamiliar. Some components had already been damaged during the forced landing. Antonov ignored them. "If this aircraft only works under perfect conditions," he said, "then it is already telling us everything we need to know." Preparations took 3 weeks. Captured American manuals were translated line by line. Damaged wiring was repaired with improvised solutions. Fuel systems were flushed. Engines inspected repeatedly. One man was kept alive for a specific reason. Lieutenant Commander James Walker, the Intruder's pilot, was brought to the airfield under guard. Exhausted, injured, but still sharp-eyed, he stared at the aircraft as Soviet markings were painted over American insignia. "You won't get it off the ground," Walker said flatly when Antonov explained the plan. Antonov met his gaze. "You flew it into enemy territory and landed it on a strip not meant for trucks," he replied calmly. "I believe it will fly." Walker laughed bitterly.
You don't understand how dependent that aircraft is. One wrong input and it flies you straight into a mountain. Antonov nodded. Then you will help us not make wrong inputs. Walker hesitated. Then his eyes drifted to the aircraft, to the jungle beyond, to the reality of what would happen if it failed in the air. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't trust the radar blindly. It lies when the terrain gets steep." Antonov filed that away. On the morning of the flight, mist hung low over the valley. The jungle was silent, as if holding its breath. Antonov climbed into the left seat. The cockpit smelled unfamiliar. Foreign materials, foreign wiring, foreign logic. The startup sequence took far longer than any Soviet aircraft he had flown. Switch after switch, system after system coming alive. "This aircraft does not want to be rushed," he noted aloud. The engines spooled up smoothly, too smoothly. At full power, the Intruder rolled forward with deceptive calm. No violence, no roar, just steady acceleration. As it lifted off, Antonov felt something unexpected. Confidence. Not his own, the aircraft's. It flew as if it expected the world to move out of its way. As the jungle dropped away beneath them, Antonov realized something unsettling. This machine was not built for survival through toughness. It was built for survival through belief. Belief that systems would function, belief that data would be accurate, belief that the enemy would react too slowly. And for the first time since the war began, Antonov wondered, what happens when that belief is wrong? The first flight was supposed to be cautious. That was the plan, at least. Antonov intended to climb to a safe altitude, test basic controls, evaluate engine response, then return. A simple systems check, nothing more. But the A-6 Intruder had other ideas. At 4,000 feet, Antonov engaged the terrain-following radar. The cockpit changed instantly. A low, constant tone filled the cabin. The radar display came alive, painting the jungle below not as chaos, but as geometry, lines, slopes, voids. The aircraft's control surfaces adjusted almost imperceptibly, trimming themselves without pilot input. Walker stiffened in the right seat. "You're letting it fly itself," he said. Antonov didn't look at him. "I am observing," he replied. The Intruder began to descend. 2,000 feet. 1,000. 500. The jungle rushed closer, treetops blurring beneath the nose. Any Soviet aircraft flying this low would already be on the edge of disaster. Manual corrections, constant visual reference, instinct fighting gravity. The Intruder didn't care. It slipped into the terrain like it belonged there. At 480 feet, the system stabilized. The aircraft followed the contours of the land automatically, climbing and dipping with uncanny smoothness. Hills rose ahead, and the Intruder rose with them. Valleys opened, and it sank into them without hesitation. Antonov felt a chill crawl up his spine. "This is obedient," he said quietly. Walker shook his head. "It's trusting. There's a difference." Antonov began gentle banks, testing lateral response. The aircraft resisted sharp movements, not sluggish, but firm,
like a machine protecting itself from reckless hands. "It corrects the pilot," Antonov noted. "Yes, sometimes too late." They flew deeper into the hills. The radar display showed a ridge rising ahead, steep, uneven. The intruder climbed automatically, engines increasing thrust without command. Then suddenly the tone changed. A warning light flashed. The aircraft hesitated. Antonov felt it immediately. A fractional delay, barely noticeable but unmistakable. The nose lifted a second too late. The treetops surged upward in the windscreen. Walker shouted, "Manual, now!" Antonov slammed the override. The intruder clawed upward violently, missing the ridge by meters. The cockpit filled with alarms. The radar tone shrieked in protest. Silence followed. Antonov leveled the aircraft and exhaled slowly. "The delay," he said. "What caused it?" Walker swallowed. "Radar shadow. Steep terrain, dense vegetation. The system thought the ridge was farther away than it really was." Antonov nodded grimly. "So when it fails suddenly." They climbed to safer altitude and continued testing. Antonov pushed the aircraft into tight turns, simulated evasive maneuvers, rapid altitude changes. The intruder responded predictably, but never eagerly. It was not a dogfighter. It was a delivery platform. Everything about it was optimized for one mission profile. Low, fast enough. Blind faith in electronics. As they leveled out, Antonov glanced at Walker. "Your pilots trust this system completely?" Walker hesitated. "They're trained to. At night, in weather, you don't have another choice." Antonov thought of Soviet pilots flying night strikes with stopwatch timing, ground vectors, and gut instinct. Crude, dangerous, but never dependent on a single system. The realization began to form. The intruder did not replace the pilot. It replaced uncertainty, and that made it dangerous. On the return leg, Antonov disengaged automation entirely and flew manually at low altitude. The aircraft felt different immediately. Heavy, unwilling, almost offended. "This machine hates improvisation," he said. Walker gave a thin smile. "That's why it kills crews when things go wrong." They landed without incident. The debrief lasted 6 hours. Soviet engineers crowded around Antonov as he spoke, diagrams hastily sketched, radar behavior debated fiercely. They were impressed, deeply impressed, but also uneasy. One engineer finally voiced what others were thinking. "It is brilliant, but it is fragile." Antonov corrected him. "No, it is confident." That night, Antonov wrote his preliminary assessment. "American strike doctrine seeks to eliminate chaos through systems. Soviet doctrine seeks to survive chaos through tolerance of failure. In Vietnam, chaos is winning." When the report was transmitted to Moscow, it triggered something rare. Silence. No rebuttal, no correction, no dismissal. Because for the first time, Soviet analysts were not reading about an enemy machine. They were reading about an enemy assumption, and that frightened them. Antonov looked once more at the intruder before it was dismantled and shipped north in pieces. "It is a beautiful weapon," he said softly. Walker nodded. "Yes, when it works." Antonov turned away. "And the war," he said, "is where things stop working." The final paragraph was underlined twice. "American strike doctrine seeks to eliminate chaos through systems. Soviet doctrine seeks to survive chaos through tolerance of failure. In Vietnam, chaos is winning." When the report was transmitted to Moscow, it triggered something rare. Silence. No rebuttal, no correction, no dismissal. Because for the first time, Soviet analysts were not reading about an enemy machine. They were reading about an enemy assumption, and that frightened them. Antonov looked once more at the intruder before it was dismantled and shipped north in pieces. "It is a beautiful weapon," he said softly. Walker nodded. "Yes, when it works." Antonov turned away. "And the war," he said, "is where things stop working."
Antonov arrived in Moscow in early July 1969. The city felt distant from Vietnam in every possible way. Clean runways, orderly bases, predictable systems, everything the A-6 Intruder assumed the world to be. His briefing was held in a secure conference room beneath the Ministry of Defense. The audience was small but formidable. Senior Air Force commanders, aircraft designers, doctrine analysts,
men who decided what wars would look like before they were ever fought. Antonov spoke for 3 hours. He described the capture, the flights, the radar system, the automation, the moment where the aircraft nearly flew itself into a mountain. No one interrupted him. When he finished, a general leaned back in his chair. "So," the general said, "is it superior?" Antonov considered the question carefully. "Yes," he answered, "and no." A murmur rippled through the room. "The A-6 Intruder," Antonov continued, "is superior at executing a known problem. It is unmatched when the environment behaves as expected, but it is catastrophically vulnerable to uncertainty." One of the designers frowned. "All aircraft are vulnerable to uncertainty." Antonov nodded. "True, but not all aircraft pretend it does not exist." He laid out his core finding. American strike doctrine, he explained, was built on predictive dominance. Sensors, computation, centralized planning. Remove ambiguity and war becomes manageable. Soviet doctrine assumed ambiguity was permanent. "Our aircraft," Antonov said, "are built to fly poorly under bad conditions. Theirs are built to fly perfectly under good ones." A pause. "Vietnam," he added, "is not good conditions." The room fell silent. Another officer finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "What does this mean for us?" Antonov answered without hesitation. "It means we should never attempt to copy this philosophy," he said, "but we must learn how to defeat it." He outlined the implication. American systems could be overwhelmed not by superior technology, but by unpredictability. Terrain masking, irregular flight paths, rapid relocation, deception. Force the system to doubt its own data, and it collapses. One general closed his folder slowly. "This explains their losses," he said. "Yes," Antonov replied, "and their confidence." The report was classified at the highest level. Its conclusions circulated quietly through design bureaus and tactical schools. No public acknowledgement, no doctrinal announcements. But changes followed. Soviet pilots began training more aggressively in degraded conditions. Radar denial exercises increased. Emphasis was placed on forcing enemy aircraft into environments where automation struggled. Not everywhere, just where it mattered. Antonov returned briefly to Vietnam before the Intruder was dismantled completely. He stood beside the stripped fuselage one last time. Wires exposed, panels removed. The machine looked suddenly fragile without its systems intact. Walker was not there. He had been transferred to another camp weeks earlier. Antonov touched the bare aluminum skin. "You trusted the world," he said quietly. "That was your mistake." The war dragged on. American aircraft continued to strike with precision. They inflicted enormous damage, but losses mounted in ways planners could not fully explain. Aircraft flew flawlessly until they didn't. Intruders vanished in bad weather. Crews flew into terrain following perfect instructions. Systems did exactly what they were designed to do, and reality punished them for it. By 1972, American doctrine began to shift. Training emphasized manual flying, visual confirmation, pilot authority over automation, redundancy not just of systems, but of judgment. The lesson came slowly, painfully. Antonov retired in 1978. He spent his remaining years teaching at the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy. His lectures were famously quiet. No rhetoric, no ideology.
Just machines, pilots, and environments. In one lecture, he summarized the intruder in a single sentence. The Americans built an aircraft that tried to remove fear. We build aircraft that assume fear is permanent. A student once asked him if he admired the A-6. Antonov smiled. I admired its honesty, he said. It never lied about what it was meant to do. Years later, after the war had ended and documents were declassified, Western analysts would piece together fragments of Antonov's report. They were surprised not by the technical assessments, but by the tone. It wasn't hostile. It was respectful. One passage became quietly famous among military theorists. Technology does not eliminate uncertainty. It only hides it until it reappears at the worst possible moment. The captured A-6 Intruder never appeared in museums. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it left fingerprints across doctrines on both sides of the Cold War. Antonov died in 1993. In his final interview, he was asked a simple question. Did flying the American aircraft change how you viewed the war? He thought for a long moment. Yes, he said. It taught me that war is not a contest of machines. It is a contest of assumptions. He looked out the window, toward a gray sky heavy with clouds. And the side whose assumptions survive reality, he added softly, is the side that wins.